It seems like GPU launches are happening almost every week lately, and they've predominantly been from Team Green with the 4070 Super, 4070 Ti Super, and the upcoming 4080 Super. But not being one to be left out, AMD are coming in with the 7600 XT, a 16GB graphics card for the somewhat affordable $329 price point. But before we get into that, here's a quick word from this video sponsor.
I'm never going to be an esports gamer. I never get any kills.
I wouldn't be so sure of that.
Is that Andy Raffel from eTeknix.com?
Yes, my son. It is me, Andy Raffel from eTeknix.com.
What are you doing here?
I'm here to bestow upon you a gift that will transform you into a true gamer. With a 24.5-inch Full HD screen, 240Hz refresh rate, 0.5 millisecond response time, AMD FreeSync Premium, and height adjustability, you'll be gaming in the big leagues in no time.
Oh, thank you.
No problem, my son. Why don't you check out the link in the description below to find out more.
So let's talk about positioning, because AMD have the RX 7600. Now, without delving too much into what I said at launch, it's a card that doesn't offer up extreme levels of performance and somewhat falls short due to its 8GB of memory, something that a lot of consumers were pretty vocal on at the time. But in an upside for AMD, Nvidia didn't really have an answer to the 7600, so AMD essentially managed to swallow up part of the lower end market. Of course, this was until Intel came along with a smattering of cards that were able to compete, and at a much lower price point. So I guess AMD essentially went away and tried to figure out what went wrong and what could be done to fix things, and that's where the 7600 XT comes into play. Sadly, it doesn't look like anyone at AMD had the idea of doing anything to the GPU core, as any eagle-eyed person will be able to see. The 7600 XT is a 7600, but just with more memory, and that's it. We're talking same GPU, same transistor count, same die size, same shading units, texture mapping units, ROPs, compute units, RT core, even down to the cache size and clock speeds. So I'm a little bit needled that they've tried to call it something else when in fact it's an RX 7600 16GB. Something that could have launched at the same time as the original 8GB model, and I honestly don't feel like it needs a launch per se, because, well, it's nothing new, and instead it's just giving gamers kind of what they asked for, especially as new games are releasing with demands that well exceed 8GB of VRAM. So there's no real point, I guess, going over the specs because nothing has changed, and while I'm unsure on how AMD are going to try and market the card, I really hope they don't go too hard in terms of the naming structure, because in my eyes, as I said, it should have been called the RX 7600 16GB and not an XT, purely because XTs in terms of, I guess, naming have normally given something more beyond just a change in memory capacity. Now, there is one spec beyond the memory capacity that's changed, and sadly, it's not the memory type, or bus, or bandwidth, but instead, due to the increase from 8 to 16GB, we're now seeing a bump in the total board power from 165 watts now up to 190. So today we have two models of the card, with the XFX QICK 309 as well as the Sapphire Pulse OC. Both cards are hitting the $329 MSRP price, and much like the 7700 XT and 7800 XT, AMD are relying on their board partners instead of having a reference model like we've seen on the 7900 series. So starting with the XFX QICK 309. XFX hasn't gone overboard with the Quicksilver 309 design. It's obviously a large aftermarket model and features a pretty big cooler, but they've kept the aesthetics pretty toned down and gone with a mostly black plastic shroud that looks presentable, but it's nothing too crazy. XFX has three main series for their graphics cards: the Mercury, the QICK, Quicksilver, and the SWFT, Swift. And this new GPU is obviously part of the QICK series, which is their mid-range option, promising a high-performance model for mainstream gamers, which means it comes with most of the premium performance features, but without the more expensive materials seen in the Merc series, keeping costs down and performance up, which is something I can totally get on board with. It's also the 309, which is their very simple numbering system, as 210 would mean two 100mm fans, and in this case it means three 90mm fans. They're pretty big fans too. 90mm fans can actually move quite a bit of air, even at lower RPM, but that does mean that this card is, well, pretty large. It measures 302mm long, 114mm wide, and 50mm deep, so 2.5 slots. So while it's not the largest graphics card on the market, it's pretty big relative to where it sits in the price and performance ratios. Down the side of the card, you'll find a pair of 8-pin PCIe connectors, making it easily compatible with last-gen power supplies and suitable for haters of the 12VH PWR, which honestly I like using, but each to their own. There's also a dual BIOS configuration built in, which can of course be flashed to a new or custom BIOS, and can easily be recovered using the other BIOS should something go wrong. At the back of the card, there are 4 display connectors comprising of 3 display ports and a single HDMI port, making it easily suited to multi-monitor configurations. Now the card does feature a full backplate which features additional ventilation, and a cool XFX logo is also cut into the middle of it. There's a large cutout towards the rear of the card, allowing the rearmost fan to push airflow right through the card, which should help significantly improve the overall cooling performance. Now tearing down the card was very easy, as it only requires 4 screws around the GPU and 4 in the backplate to remove it, making it easy to strip, clean and reassemble the card when required. The XFX QICK 7600 XT uses a fully digital PWM 6+2 phase power design, which XFX say allows it to reach 15 watts over the reference specifications, as well as an additional 44 MHz boost clock out of the box. The GPU has 4 2GB memory ICs surrounding it, along with another 4 on the rear of the card, giving us the 16GB GDDR6 total, which should be better for higher texture settings and higher resolution gaming, at least in theory. The heatsink uses a nickel-plated solid copper cold plate, which features a larger raised surface just for the GPU die, but also a surrounding surface that cools the memory ICs, and a further wide strip separate from this to cool the power delivery hardware, all of which feed into a large aluminium heatsink. Now the heatsink is split into a few sections, but features 5 6mm heat pipes to ensure that the heat is evenly distributed so that those 3 90mm fans can do their job. Taking a quick look at the back of the backplate, you can see there are 3 more thermal pads here, ensuring the capacitors and the PCB behind the VRAM are cooled as well. Moving on to the Sapphire Pulse OC card. The card looks great with the classic black and red that we've come to expect from Sapphire's Pulse series. The shroud is pretty straightforward with a large enclosure that's mainly made from plastic, but it does look pretty gamer with that old school PC gaming black and red theme. It features 2 powerful fans which are massive and run pretty much edge to edge. The fans feature Sapphire's angular velocity fan blade design and utilises a ball bearing motor which can operate at up to 1700 RPM, and both should provide more than enough cooling performance for this low to mid-range GPU. Down the side of the card there's a red Sapphire graphic on one side with a red Radeon logo on the other. And then, tucked into the side of the card, you'll find a pair of 8-pin GPU power connectors, meaning it's compatible with older PSU designs and doesn't require the newer 12VH PWR connector that we see on the current crop of Nvidia GPUs. The backplate looks gorgeous with a full metal plate that features that Pulse graphic running right through the GPU core, as well as the Pulse logo and another Radeon logo as well. There's also a bit of additional ventilation towards the back of the backplate, allowing heat to be exhausted by the fan behind it, but it's not as large as an area that we've seen of ventilation on other GPUs, but it certainly will still help with cooling regardless. At the back of the card you'll find 4 display connections with 3 display ports and a single HDMI port. Then tearing down the card you can see that the PCB is almost the full size of the heatsink. It's a fairly short graphics card in the grand scheme of things, especially when compared to some of the monster size cards that have hit the market in recent years. The GPU core is surrounded by 4 memory ICs on this side, each featuring 2GB of GDDR6 memory, while the rear of the card is where we find the other 4, giving the card its key selling point of 16GB of VRAM. The heatsink is a good size and features a composite triple heat pipe design that will help evenly distribute heat throughout the card. It's not a huge heatsink, but considering the card is keeping to a 2-slot design, there's still a fair bit of metal in here. There are large contact points ensuring the GPU itself, the VRAM and the power delivery hardware are all directly cooled by the heatsink, which should help maintain thermal and system performance during those long gaming sessions. There are even additional thermal pads on the back of the PCB, allowing the backplate to passively cool these components rather than just adding to the rigidity and aesthetics of the card. So 2 cards that are very typical of what we'd expect for a GPU at this level. And while I've said it on our Nvidia content, I feel that things need to be said again, as AIBs as of late have actually done a great job in improving upon their designs in terms of materials and just style. Everything just seems to be a little bit better in all areas, and I'm all for that after the last couple of years of seeing overpriced plasticky GPUs. Finally, it seems like things are settling down a bit and consumers are now able to get a great product for a semi-reasonable price. Now, as always, when we have multiple SKUs of the same GPU, it makes no sense to test both cards in the full suite of games. Instead, we focus on one model and then test the other in a small selection of games, just really for our own peace of mind to make sure performance is within the same realm of each other. because other than the clock speed being slightly different going from one model AIB to the next, that will only really show a margin of error difference, and instead performance really comes down to cooling capabilities, and that's something we'll look at later on. So to test, we put the XFX card on our GPU test bench with an AMD Ryzen 7 7800X3D sitting in a Gigabyte B650E Aorus Master with 32GB of Corsair Vengeance RGB, 6000MHz CL30 dual channel memory. All testing was done on Windows 11 with the latest updates applied and with the latest BIOS revision for the motherboard we used. We also used AMD's 23.40.01.15 driver, and we tested 16 games in total. Now we will be looking at 1080p and 1440p today before taking a look at the overall averages, and we'll be testing more games in the near future. So if you want to see all of the data for that, then you can over on our Patreon, as well as obviously performance at 4K. Not that it matters. The link for that is as always down below. Also, as the 7600 XT is essentially a 7600 with more VRAM, our focus really is going to be on the performance difference and if the extra VRAM can push the 7600 XT up in our standings, especially as the 7600 8GB comes in 18% cheaper. So, with that out of the way, let's get into those glorious benchmarks. So starting with the Plague Tale Requiem, and it's here where the RX 7600 was just falling short of the 60fps threshold that most gamers crave. And even with a 5% increase in performance, the 7600 XT also just sits behind at 59fps, so margin of error, but still nothing fantastic, especially considering we're only at 1080p. As we move up to 1440p, the increase in performance is even smaller at just under 3%, which actually equates to just 1 FPS, though the 1% lows do grow by 6%, so silver linings and all that. Though at around 40 FPS, it's not going to be the best gaming experience anyway, and for 22% more money, it's a bit of a flop at the early stages of our testing. Moving over to Baldur's Gate 3, and it's a similar story at 1080p with just a 4% increase in performance over the 8GB RX 7600. While this does move the 7600 XT up in our standings, it's only just above the RTX 2080 Super from yesteryear, so nothing really of huge significance, especially considering that card only had 8GB of VRAM. At 1440p again, we are talking small gains of around 3%, which could be deemed as margin of error, and again sees no change to our standings, where the likes of the RTX 2080 Super manages to push ahead, albeit by 1 FPS. But many other older cards are quite further up in our results and can be had for the same price used or actually cheaper. Call of Duty finally sees a result that's worth talking about as the RX 7600 came in at 121 FPS with the RTX 4060 Ti just ahead at 125, which is a 3% margin. The 7600 XT manages to squeeze out 7% more frames compared to its little brother, which now means that it sits ahead of the more expensive 4060 Ti by 4%, which is more like it. More performance, cheaper price, but Call of Duty does favour AMD somewhat, as you can see from the rest of our results. At 1440p, we see some bigger gains of 6% over the RX 7600, which now sees AMD leapfrog the RTX 4060 Ti, 3070 and 2080 Ti, though in some cases we're talking 1 to 2%. And considering the extra price tag on the RX 7600 XT, while we know the 4060 Ti isn't great value for money, the 7600 XT seems to sit in the same area. Cyberpunk at 1080p sees our biggest gain yet of 11% over the RX 7600, which is definitely getting closer to where I'd want things to be from a value for money perspective. But even then, it only surpasses the RTX 2080 Super in our chart, and older and cheaper cards are available that also perform better. It's the same at 1440p, where we see another 11% uplift in performance going from the RX 7600 to the 7600 XT, which again puts it past the aging 2080 Super, but still falls short of that 60fps marker, and instead is beaten by the likes of the RTX 3070 and 2080 Ti, which can be had used for cheaper, and also shows that the 3070 with its 8GB of VRAM means that, well, memory isn't everything. Enabling ray tracing sees a huge gain of 28% over the RX 7600, but in real world terms, we're talking 5 FPS, and still means that AMD sit at the bottom of our chart, and that pesky 2080 Super now sits 39% ahead of this 7600 XT, with its 1% low matching the overall average of the new AMD GPU. Though it's not really worth talking about due to the dire performance at 1080p, the 7600 XT at 1440 comes in with 63% more performance compared to its younger brother, which is a fantastic uplift if it wasn't for the performance being so low in the first place. FSR will really be your only saving grace here, but still won't be enough to do anything of significance to raise the overall performance to playable levels. In F1 we see some respectable numbers on the 7600 XT at 228 FPS, but when comparing to the rest of our stand-ins, it's not exactly groundbreaking. Sure, at $329 the performance looks good, but when comparing against other cards it just disappoints again, especially as the extra VRAM only equates to a margin of error 4% uplift in overall performance when compared to the RX 7600. 1440p has the 7600 XT coming in with 7% more performance than its younger brother, which again now puts the newer card just above the RTX 2080 Super, which was matching the performance of the RX 7600. Again, older cards like the 2080 Ti still sit ahead of the XT and with less VRAM, so if AMD were hedging their bets on more memory making up for things, they are severely mistaken. F123 with ray tracing enabled shows how biased the game can be for AMD, even with ray tracing, as we see an 11% increase in overall performance over the 7600, which now puts it level with the RTX 4060, a card that we've made clear doesn't offer great bang for buck, though it's nice to see over 60 FPS with ray tracing enabled. At 1440p, the 7600 XT runs out of steam as, even with an 11% gain over the 7600 8GB, it's still not enough to take on anything from Nvidia in terms of the RTX 4060 or 2080 Super and above. Now, what were AMD actually thinking at this point? Well, it's kind of beyond me, as I'm really struggling to see any upside to this card that I fear will offer pretty terrible price to performance figures. In Far Cry 6, the 7600 XT now manages to beat the performance of the RTX 4060 and 4060 Ti in both the averages and 1% lows, thanks to the 5% increase in frames from the lowly RX 7600. Though Far Cry does have a somewhat AMD bias, so it's nothing out of the ordinary, and in my opinion, still isn't enough to warrant the extra cost involved. It's 5% again in the averages at 1440p and a further 6% in the lows, which does show that the extra VRAM makes a difference there. But beyond smoothing that out and increasing performance, the 7600 XT still sits exactly where you'd expect it, which I guess is fine, but I was hoping for higher gains overall. When enabling ray tracing and moving down to 1080p, the RX 7600 was at the bottom of our standings, and while the 7600 XT does increase performance beyond that by 10%, it just means the position of the higher capacity card takes the second lowest place, and still sits behind everything from Nvidia. Moving up to 1440p, performance jumps by 14% from the RX 7600, which now puts the XT 5% ahead of the RTX 4060, which at $299, the 5% extra performance of the 7600 XT doesn't make that much sense, considering the $329 price tag of the 7600 XT, which makes it 10% more expensive. Moving over to Hogwarts Legacy, which is known for its AMD bias, and while it's enough to give an extra 7% in performance, now matching the 2080 Super, that's not much of a win, even if the 1% lows are dramatically improved. Sure, the RTX 4060 now sits 10% behind, but that's never been a great value for money GPU anyway. So what exactly are AMD winning here? As you move up to 1440p, the 7600 XT manages to fend off the 2080 Super by a single FPS and keeps its stronger 1% low figure, as seen on the RX 7600. Again, it beats the RTX 4060, but the 7600 was already ahead of that anyway, so why anyone would spend extra to get a single FPS more when compared to the 8GB variant is beyond me. When enabling ray tracing, the 4060 manages to fight back along with the older 2080 Super, and even with a huge 142% increase in frames over the 7600, at just 29 FPS, Hogwarts is still pretty unplayable, so another win for Nvidia here. At 1440p, AMD is just, well, a hot mess across multiple cards, including the 7600, 7600 XT, and 7700 XT, which garnered the same result time and time again. The likes of the 2080 Ti and up, which are cheaper, are where you'd want to be at a minimum, but even then, it's not going to be the greatest experience overall. Spider-Man really leaves me with, well, nothing to say. We're talking margin of error of 1 FPS, though as we move up the chart, you can see that bottlenecks are really quite evident, so it's best not factoring in these results in here for anything meaningful. At 1440p, the results sort themselves out a bit, as we now see the 7600 XT coming in with 10% more performance. Still nowhere near where I'd expect things to be, but better than the RTX 4060 by 6%, which is a hollow victory given the price point, but I guess AMD would see that as a win. Enabling ray tracing, and we start to see some good gains of 59%, now putting the 7600 XT matched with the 2080 Super at 65 FPS, but with much better lows. Sadly, as it's ray tracing, Nvidia do have the upper hand across the board from the 4060 upwards, further cementing just how bad valued this card is. It's the same at 1440p, where we do have playable figures and a hefty 70% increase in performance, which again puts it above the 2080 Super, but is that really something to write home about? New AMD GPU beats 20 series card in latest title. Not much of a headline, is it? Finally, we start to see something of substance from Ratchet and Clank at 1080p, but Nvidia do suffer in this title, especially in the 1% lows. That aside, we're now seeing a 100% uptake in performance from the 7600 to the XT, which leaves the 4060 and 4060 Ti behind in its dust, and with a much more enjoyable gaming experience overall. The uplift isn't as big at 1440p, but 92% is still nothing to grumble at, and again it manages to fend off Team Green. Though with just a single FPS difference with the 4060 Ti, it's a win, but only just. But again, more than makes up for it in the 1% lows that really need addressing by the developers, as Nvidia really do suffer here. Memory capacity really plays a big part when enabling ray tracing, as is shown by the 7700 XT, which drops down the table, and instead sees the 7600 XT with 4GB more actually moving up. It again beats the 4060, but isn't enough for the 4060 Ti, which even though it has less memory, more than makes up for it in RT cores. At 1440p, it's very much the same again, with the 7600 XT improving upon its lacklustre performance on the RX 7600 8GB. But going from nothing to something doesn't mean it's great by any means, as Nvidia still hold the lead across multiple cheaper GPUs. In our last game, Starfield, we see gains of around 12% from the 7600 8GB, which was already matching the performance of the RTX 4060. But even with the increase in memory size, the 4060 Ti still holds a lead of 17%, which considering it comes in 18% more expensive, I'd actually chalk that up as a win for Team Green, even though Starfield does favour AMD, though with updates, that is levelling out somewhat. Then finally at 1440p, the 7600 that was trailing behind the RTX 4060 sees a boost of 11% going to the 7600 XT, which now puts it 1 FPS ahead of Nvidia's cheaper offering. So a win, but then again, based on price, not really. So another GPU launch and another set of painful results. Seems that both AMD and Nvidia are pushing higher memory capacities and consumers are begging for it, but in the grand scheme of things, it's just not lining up with expectations. And that's a pretty sorry state of affairs. I mean, based on performance, this card should have never been called a 7600 XT, and instead should have stuck with a simple RX 7600 16GB naming structure. Because in my eyes, at least in terms of markets and things like that, XT makes it sound like you're getting so much more for your money. And without even kind of looking at the cost per frame, I think it's clear to see that pricing is way off the mark. So speaking of price, when we take a look at the 1080p cost per frame, it's clear to see that there really isn't a huge amount in it between the RX 7600 and 7600 XT, separated by just 10 cents per frame. Now that the RTX 4060 has matured somewhat, it's actually coming in better value overall, though the 7800 XT is the clear winner at $4.70 per frame, but will involve spending another $170 to reap the rewards. So I guess what I'm trying to say is if you're on a budget, and it is quite a strict one, at 1080p, the RTX 4060 actually seems to be the card to go for now, unless you can obviously find the extra cash. Yes, the 7600 XT does give 8% more performance overall when compared to the 4060, but is 10% more expensive, so just falls short when looking at value for money. As we move up to 1440p, the 7600 XT does even worse, now being beaten by the 4060, 7700 XT, 6950 XT, and even the newer RTX 4070 Super from Nvidia. And again, that's 7800 XT coming in the cheapest per frame, which I guess makes it the most affordable 16GB card in terms of performance on the market. Though the 7600 XT is officially, I guess, the cheapest 16GB GPU you can buy, aside from the Intel Arc A770, which can be had slightly cheaper, but is still hit or miss depending on the games you play. Now, as mentioned, we have two cards here from different AIBs, the XFX QICK 309 and the Sapphire Pulse OC, and each have their own merits for cooling performance, power, and fan speeds. It's here where we put them both through a 1-hour loop of F123 to see how they hold up over time, and to simulate a prolonged gaming session. So starting with the XFX card, where the GPU temperature was kept under control at 59 degrees, while the hotspot rose to 81, so I guess a little bit on the warm side, but nothing to cause concern. The memory also was on the warmer scale at 84 degrees, but nothing serious. The clock speed rose to 2751 MHz for the most part, with the GPU fan staying pretty conservative around 1600 RPM. Considering the max power draw of 190 watts, the XFX actually managed to come in just below at 184 watts. Then taking a look at the Sapphire card, which came in slightly warmer on the GPU at 67 degrees, and with a hotspot of 86, so again on the warmer side, but still well within thermal tolerances. The memory junction temperature was the same as the XFX at 84 degrees, while the clock speed wasn't as high at just 2557 MHz. But in terms of performance, the Sapphire was within margin of error limits of where the XFX card was. In terms of the fan speed, it was a little higher than the XFX at just under 1700 RPM, but still within the territory of being fairly inaudible, and also just peaked above its power limits at 192 watts. So where to start with this one? Well, I think I've made it pretty clear that the GPU from AMD has it all wrong in terms of its naming structure. 7600 XT makes it sound like you're getting a lot more, when in fact, it's all in one area, memory. And while I have to put the blame onto AMD, they are essentially doing what consumers asked when it was made clear that 8GB in 2023 just wasn't enough. And moving into 2024, gamers wanted more. And well, this is the end result. Now, I'm not trying to put the blame on the consumers because while they asked for more memory, much like with the 4060 Ti, AMD obliged. But that's all they did. Surely getting some more performance out of the GPU core or utilising a cut down 7700 XT core would have more sense to kind of give it more of a purpose. But as with this, like we've seen time and time again, it's AMD doing AMD things. And after being in this industry for close to 20 years, nothing surprises me anymore. Generally, when I look at GPUs, there's a silver lining to it all. But I'm really struggling on this one, but that's kind of been the case on the last few launches from both AMD and Nvidia. And I think it shows just how out of touch they are with consumers, which is a shame because AMD have always been quite, I guess, community driven and focused on offering great value for money, which is the case on the desktop CPU division. But GPUs have just fallen by the wayside, and that's an opportunity for someone to scoop up. So it wouldn't surprise me if Intel come in even stronger when their new products release. Clearly, there's a market available to them. And I honestly feel like AMD and Nvidia have tried and to a degree failed. So why not give, I guess, essentially the new guy a chance? It's a shame. And while AMD can have the bragging rights to a degree with Intel to one side of having the cheapest 16GB GPU out right now, that's kind of where it starts and ends. The A770 is the cheapest 16GB card, but they just don't have the same momentum that kind of Team Green and Team Red have. And that's why I'm cautious on saying that it's comparable. Right now, if you have a budget of $329, I'd probably go with something older that is still capable. Or, personally, I would try to increase that budget and go for the 7800 XT. In all of our latest content, it keeps cropping up as the best value card you can buy right now. And yeah, even though it costs more, it's very, very hard to ignore. For now, that's going to end this one. Let me know if you agree with me. Have AMD created essentially a dumpster fire? Or, I don't know, maybe I'm just being too harsh. As always, I value your comments, so put them in down below. And if you enjoyed this video, then a like and the sub to the channel would be amazing. And if you love what we do, then you can join the super exclusive Patreon club, where you'll get access to all of our charts, including 4K tests, a super special area over on our Discord, link down below, behind the scenes content and live streams just for our Patreons. The link for all that great stuff is down below. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you in the next one. See you later, guys. Bye-bye.